Welcome to Open Plaza, created by the Hispanic Theological Initiative. In this episode, Dr. Jorge Juan Rodríguez talks to Dr. Felipe Hinojosa, Dr. Maggie Elmore, and Dr. Sergio González about editing the volume, Faith and Power, Latino Religious Politics Since 1945. For more information about today's episode, visit htiopenplaza.org.
Welcome to the HTI Open Plaza podcast. I'm Dr. Jorge Juan Rodríguez V. I'm a historian of religion and social movements, as well as the Associate Director for Strategic Programming at the Hispanic Summer Program. I'm here today with Dr. Felipe Hinojosa, who's the Director of the Carlos H. Cantu Hispanic Education and Opportunity Endowment and Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M. We're also joined by Dr. Maggie Elmore, Assistant Professor of History at Sam Houston State University, and Dr. Sergio González, Assistant Professor of History and Latinx Studies at Marquette University. We're here to discuss the book they co-edited with NYU Press entitled Faith and Power, Latino Religious Politics Since 1945. It's an excellent book. And it's now available anywhere you get your literature, which is many places these days, but I'm excited to have the three of them here with us. So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about the book in general. It's an edited volume, but nonetheless, there is still kind of some through lines and theses that are being advanced. So I would love to hear from one of you or all three of you kind of what the main purpose of this book is and what gap in scholarship you hope to fill through its collected works.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of thinking about the gap in the literature, I mean, I think, first of all, let me just say that I'm very grateful to you, Jorge, for hosting this conversation, to HTI, to all the people that are out there listening. We're very grateful for this opportunity. The next thing that I'll say is that, for me, and I think this was a case, for Sergio and Maggie, for all of us, is that what really rang through were that there were stories that we wanted to tell and stories that we wanted to write. Obviously we're historians, and so we work off of this notion and this idea of having conversations with other historians. And so filling in the gap in the literature is it's important work. It's what we do, right? But the driving force was the fact that we all believed that there were stories that needed to be told, that stories that helped to explain community formation in Latino communities and how that happens and the role that faith plays in all of that. And so for me, that was the driving force to put this book together. And the fact that there were so many wonderful and great folks that came together and to do this really gives us a broad sense of the experiences from Latino communities from New York to LA, Texas, Chicago, the Midwest. All of that was I think critically important for what we did in this volume.
And I know that the text is divided into three sections, and each of you kind of had a hand in coordinating each of the sections. So I believe the order is Maggie, Felipe, and Sergio's in terms of how the sections are constructed. So Maggie, you want to tell us a little bit about your section and what you were hoping to aim there and the scope of it?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jorge. So we sat down to write this, or to edit this book, and to have the privilege of bringing folks together. One of the things that was of central importance to us was thinking about how closely tied together faith and politics are, particularly in community formation. And when we thought about the stories we wanted to tell, we realized that a lot of these stories had previously focused on places like Texas in particular, or the Southwest. And that place was something that hadn't been studied or thought about as critically as we wanted it to be in regards to politics and religion, or faith in particular. And that there were a number of overlooked places like the Midwest, for example, like Wisconsin, places even in California that folks had not written about. And even more than that, that you can't understand a person's faith, their identity, or the creation of their community if you don't think about how they go about making home, how they go about making a place and building a community. So we pulled together folks who were doing the best and most interesting work on those topics, and they weren't necessarily historians of religion, And, we were privileged to see what came out of that.
In your first section, it kind of covers the earlier parts of this text, right? Because this text spans from 1945 to present day, and yours kind of covers the earlier mid 20th century period. Is that correct, Maggie?
Yeah, that is correct. So I was especially interested in thinking about how institutional politics work in regards to faith, and how faith leaders have drawn upon institutional politics. And then also how communities then have tapped into that resource. And so I looked specifically at Catholics and the federal government during that World War II period, which is really pivotal for kicking off this conversation. And it's a big moment of change for the communities that we study.
And Felipe, your section, the section you kind of took a lead on in your chapter, moves away from World War II and moves more into the civil rights period. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So we call that the freedom movements section, and which you're a part of, Jorge. So it's great to, you could speak to this as well. But yeah, I think it just, in a sense, really looks at the generation that follows the Great Migration of Puerto Ricans in and around World War II, that follows the multiple migrations of Mexicano communities to different parts of the United States. That go further back, right? And then, growing up and not just using faith as to instigate social movements. In other words, not just people of faith within church communities, building social movements from there, but also what the outsiders say, what people on the margins of faith have to say, what the youth that were just completely turned off by religion in the 1960s, what they had to say in terms of questions of faith and community and what it meant to them, what it didn't mean to them, the critique of the church. We wanted to take that head on. And I think in the chapters that we assembled, we look at movements in rural America, in urban America. We look at, we were so lucky to get Lara Medina, the historian Lara Medina, who wrote a wonderful book, Las Hermanas, to help us to close off that section, to think about, okay, here's the important work that was done and why does it continue to matter today to social movements in the Latino community today. We end with Lara. We start with Lloyd Barba talking about the movements in the fields in Central California. We move to you, Jorge, talking about New York City. I look at sort of a mix of urban and rural movements and the ways in which they took shape in these communities. And so I think we wanted to make sure we got as broad a look as possible to faith movements, because it's not just people, it's not just clergy, it's not just religious leaders, it's also young people outside of these churches. And I think we did a great job. All right.
And Sergio, the section you led and wrote in kind of builds from those themes to then look at the post-freedom movement era. Is that correct? And a little bit about the sanctuary movement as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the final section tries to bring us as close to the present day as possible, and it tries to contextualize what today is perhaps one of the most pressing issues for many Latino communities, which is, of course, immigration justice and refugee and migrant justice. And so, our final section here begins with the idea of sanctuary, which develops in the 1980s, a response to the migration of Central Americans fleeing persecution in their home countries, and really the way in which white clergy and white laity in the United States respond to that development of kind of interethnic relationships and interethnic social movements. And then I think one of the things that really sets our book apart is the question of scale. We do a great job in each of the sections jumping in from the really macro questions, right? So Maggie was talking about institutions, and in the final section, Eladio Bobadilla kind of does a similar thing, thinking about immigration reform and immigration movements at the world of the elites and kind of large institutions. But we also jump down to the really granular and the locals. So in our final section, we have a chapter from Ann Martinez looking at the microscopic changes, demographic changes that happen in places like Pilsen and Chicago, right? So how do these big questions of demographic change affect local communities, and how do people understand those changes and fight for a sense of dignity and justice within religious spaces? And then I think one of the really exciting chapters in our book is from Yuridia Ramirez, who takes us to the South. kind of budding areas of scholarship, thinking about new Latino communities that developed in the US South over the last few decades. And so, this final chapter is trying to think about where we are today, but to remind both historians and kind of a general public, of course, that we can't understand the recent shifts in migration, immigration within Latino communities across this country without understanding this larger scope. And as Maggie said, without really placing it within the context of how Latinos and the people in which they interact with have understood those changes as a question of both faith and of politics.
And so in many respects, this text is a book that covers, the mid-20th century to the present, really looking at the intersections of religion, spirituality, politics, place, geography in Latinx communities, Latina communities, in order to assess how people make meaning in their context. And so I would love to hear from you, from the three of you, a little bit about how you all make meaning in your own context and how that informs your academic work. Because we know that academic work does not stem from a vacuum, but rather it stems from our own experiences in the world and our own, those moments that shaped us deeply. So I would love to hear a little bit from each of you about how your own life story, however you want to talk about that, how that informs the questions you brought into this academic work. So let's start with Sergio. Let's go backwards.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of faith and politics has always been central both to my academic work, but also the work that I do as an activist outside of academic spaces. I mean, I grew up in an immigrant and labor justice family. I grew up going on Sunday mornings with my mom to do what was referred to as labor at the pulpit. So at the end of Mass, she'd have the opportunity to go and talk to kind of this captive audience of congregants about the importance of labor activism and joining a union. And so that was kind of the space in which I grew up. And as I went into graduate school, I started writing a little bit about this history here in Wisconsin, my home state. And in 2016, after the last presidential election, I got involved in sanctuary work in Madison as well, helping restart the sanctuary movement in my adopted home in Madison. And so the question of faith and politics in many ways has always been kind of in the air around me. And the work I do outside of this book, and then specifically in communion here with and fellowship with my fellow colleagues here, was an opportunity to think about that as an academic subject as well, right? And to kind of put historical markers to understand the way in which Latinos have been organizing over the last few years within faith spaces in a much larger historical canon.
That's awesome. Felipe, would you like to share a little bit about that and your own story?
Yeah, listen, I grew up a preacher's kid. I grew up surrounded by churches. I grew up, with hermanos, hermanas, and the evangelical tradition, in the Anabaptist tradition of peace and justice. And growing up, our church was always involved in community efforts. We had neighborhood projects. There was a gymnasium where guys from around the neighborhood came to play basketball. People gathered, quinceañeras, weddings. There was a strong sense of community that was held and that was there. And growing up on the border and being evangelical, I was in the minority, man. And so 95% of the community there, or probably higher, is Católico. And I feel like my work is, in one sense, trying to make sense of where evangelicals fit within that world, but also then trying to make sense of where do these ideas of churches getting involved in their communities, is it biblical references? Is it theology? Is it culture? Is it identity? What are the forces that contribute to churches that as a collective make use of their space and make use of their understandings of God and the world to trying to make it a better place. And that's what I grew up in. And it for me it all seemed very, very normal, very much the thing to do. And now that I'm looking back at that upbringing and trying to make sense of it in the work that I do, I'm really cognizant of trying to highlight and trying to make sense of where these kind of movements emerged from, the ways in which they took place, and how people made sense of their world, how they made community, how they forged it. So I think it's been a real pleasure for me, I think, to do this, but also going back and just remembering that all of the folks that have been involved historically in these movements have come at it from different perspectives, and trying to understand that has been what I've been trying to do. So.
And how about for you, Maggie? What's your story? What do you bring into this text?
It's a good question. My experience is a little bit different than Sergio and Felipe's. I grew up in a white community and white family. My mom's white. My dad was born to a Brazilian mother and a white father, born in Brazil, and came to the US as a young child. And so I'm born to a very Catholic family. And my dad's side of the family maintained their ties through their religion. One of the ways that they kept family ties was through, for example, sending rosaries through the mail regularly, even when we couldn't talk because of the cost of international phone conversations, or see each other. We'd send prayer cards and rosaries and things like that. But what really got me thinking about faith and politics had to do with my experience as a young single mother living in rural West Texas, where faith and politics are tied together, not in a progressive way often, but in a very repressive way. And as a young single mom, applying for welfare and having to go to the basement of a Catholic church to seek those resources caused me at 19 to have a lot of questions about why was I going there? And what would it be like if I didn't have a sense of a Catholic cosmology? It would be very alienating, all of these things. And so as I journeyed through academia, I began to have a lot of questions about how do faith and politics impact one another, both for the good. A lot of the folks that I study, and certainly the folks in our volume, enact incredible progressive change through their faith, but also through the power of religious institutions by drawing upon that power, but also recognizing that can have a marginalizing effect as well and can harm communities as well. And so where do we find that balance between these things?
Maggie's reflection here is really leading me to a broader question about the book, but also about your own stories, which is that in many respects, the text and this leans towards progressive visions of faith and politics. It's not exclusive to that. There are also instances in the chapters about conservative visions of faith and politics, but it leans progressive. What I mean by progressive is that it's not necessarily leftists, who want to deconstruct capitalism, although there are those. It's not necessarily liberals, although there are who want to have social reform within capitalism. There are those, but those who want to have social change versus conservatives who want to kind of maintain the status quo. And I'm wondering, do you agree with my depiction of the text that it leans towards progressive visions of faith and politics? That's question one. And two is, why include that? Why include those types of more progressive visions as opposed to, there's a myriad of scholarship on conservative, especially with Latinos, about Latinos and evangelicalism, Latinos and Trump. What's at stake in leaning towards progressive visions without losing also some of those instances of conservative faith and politics? Maybe Sergio, do you want to start?
I mean, I think you're right, Jorge, that if we look at the chapters in the whole, many of the individuals that we write about as a collective are inspired by movements for justice and movements for dignity for communities that have often been marginalized in the places that try to make home in the United States. As you note, there are some exceptions here. I think Jorge Vega's chapter on Mormons is a really complicated chapter, right? On the Church of Latter-day Saints, which you kind of see all of this playing out within these small communities in which Latino Mormons may, politically be understood as being more conservative, but within their own church spaces are trying to push for a more open space for Latino believers. I think we didn't intentionally try to create a volume where most of the people were writing about these kind of progressive individuals. I think it somewhat naturally happened that way as we started to collect and think about who we wanted to be included. But I think in general, we think about the way in which many Americans consider Latinos and faith. The impulse is to think about faith as being a conservative force, and that if Latinos are naturally Catholic or naturally religious, that means they may naturally also be conservative in their politics. And I think the point of our text is to show that it's so much more complicated than that, that there's nothing natural about any of this, and that we can't draw straight lines in thinking about political ideology and faith and the way in which people understand the world religiously. And so each of our chapters, I think, kind of gestures towards the way in which communities are grappling with all of these questions, and that there aren't these neat and tidy spaces in which we can kind of place people. I'll also note that our conclusion written by Jerry Cadava, who of course is a leading scholar of Latino conservatism in the United States, he makes gestures, I think, at where the field needs to go next. And one of the things that was exciting about putting this text together was knowing that we are kind of planting seeds for what's coming after us. In no way is this a definitive volume. We are excited about what comes after, and who will correct us, and who will, remind us of what needs to be done next, and that next set of graduate students that are going to dig even deeper into these questions.
And Maggie, I'm wondering what you think about this question about the political angles of the text, especially given the story you just shared about your own relationship to the Catholic Church, et cetera.
That's a great question. One of the things that for me was so exciting about this volume is that in each of our chapters, we get a sense of how individuals are so politically complicated themselves. Identity is never static. It's very fluid. You can have folks like in Delia Fernandez's chapter who are on the one hand quite progressive in some of their ideas about inclusion, but in the enacting of those visions can be quite conservative about who should have a voice, who should have power, et cetera. And so I think, naturally we did tend to collect stories that had a more progressive air about them, in part because that was the scholarship that we had done and that was, being done more prominently. But also, I think in each of these chapters, we tried to show how complex each individuals are, and how things can really be contingent upon the complexities of a historical moment, right? And in one moment, one person might be quite progressive, but in the next moment, they might be quite conservative. I will say that I think one of the questions that the volume raises are sort of the limits of progressive action in faith institutions, right? Are there real limits once they achieve a lot of political power? And I think that's an important direction for the field to continue to develop.
Yeah, and I very much identify with this question myself. My chapter in the text is about the Young Lords, this group of radical Puerto Ricans here in New York City, originally from Chicago, but created a chapter here in New York City, and their occupation of this Methodist church in East Harlem. And part of what brought me to this was that I used to be in evangelical spaces and have a lot of questions about, some of these conservative ideas don't necessarily make sense with the realities of my community, particularly being in white conservative evangelical spaces. And speaking about the Young Lords was this thing where it was just like, oh, there is messiness here. There are other ways to conceive of religion and politics. There are more complex. Many of the Young Lords themselves didn't necessarily identify as Christian, but we're still using Christian theology to make meaning in the world. And that very much resonated with me in my own story. And yet, in so many respects, these are stories that often aren't read either by historians or by folks in Latino studies or by folks in religious studies, in part precisely because they sit at these complex intersections that are often contradictory and don't necessarily fall interdisciplinary lines. So to that end, I wanted to ask the three of you, particularly about one angle, I'm thinking about the audience of this podcast, is how did you choose to talk about religion in this text? All three of you are historians, and I know there are some scholars of religious studies in the volume, but the three of you as editors, how did you think about religion in this text, and what are the kind of challenges and opportunities about thinking about religion specifically within historical analysis or Latinx studies? I'm going to start with Felipe, because he's smiling.
Oh man, yeah. Well, I'm just going to tell you that in all of the wonderful conversations, and Jorge, what a joy to work with Maggie and Sergio, and the great conversations that we had in putting all this together. But really, I think it feels like the more that I do this, the more that I study religion, the less that I understand about religion and the way it actually works. Like, it just gets, like we've already been saying, right, really complicated and so forth. And I I want to say that, or I will say that one of the most important things for us is that we wanted folks that had come to the study of religion as outsiders themselves, right? We wanted, first of all, wanted historians to write in this volume. We were very specific. So whatever critiques we get about, the kind of scholars who are contributing, fine, bring it. We want to hear it, absolutely. But we were intentional about that. And the second thing was that we wanted folks that weren't necessarily trained in the history of religion, that in the process of their own research, in the archives, in the oral histories and everything, that they, were welcomed into the church, really. Let's just say it that way, right? That they couldn't ignore it, that it was such a force in the work that they were doing that they had to write it. And that for us was really exciting, because that means that there are fresh perspectives. That means that there's new ideas, new angles, new ways to think about the institution of the church, grassroots activism, the ways in which they came together. And that was the most exciting thing, for all of us, because what we wanted is, your question about sort of the progressive leaning of all of that is, at the same time, this is all driven by, scholars that are wanting to do everything in their power so that when their readers read that chapter, they recognize this community. They can see themselves either in it or other communities in it, and they get a broader sense of historical change and change over time, right? In the sense that to be Mexicano or Puerto Rican or Cubano in the 1940s and 1950s means something radically than it does today. And that also includes faith, the way that faith is practiced, the ideologies, the theology, all of that changes. And we wanted to show that. And I think each of these chapters do that. Each of these authors do that very, very well. But, what approach did we take on religion? And that was your question. I always, I don't know. If you read the intro, I don't know, Maggie and Sergio, y'all can talk about this. I don't even know if we wanted to define it. Like, we were just sort of like, let's just tell these stories and maybe people will figure it out, No, there was a lot of thought that got put into it, but I think we wanted to make sure that people knew that that number one, we're not, trying to be, we're not trying to sort of take this topic, which is huge, of religion. We're not taking it lightly at all. As a matter of fact, we're taking it very seriously. And because we're doing that, we want to make sure that we don't put it in a neat little box and define it in one particular way and say that it's this. We're hoping that as you read each chapter and as you move through the time periods, that the sense of what religion is and what it means changes in your head. We're hoping that you have more questions by the time you finish reading Jerry's book, the afterword that Jerry wrote for the book, that you have more questions, that each chapter raises new questions and new ideas for you and gets you thinking about religion in new ways. If it does that, then I think, we've done our job.
And in so many ways, part of what you're offering here is that the book, by virtue of being an edited volume, allows for multiple perspectives on the same questions. And there are some guiding central themes. So to that end, I wanted to ask a little bit about what it was like to edit a volume together. So in the Latinx theological tradition, there's this concept of en conjunto, or doing things together, and the idea that we never travel alone. The reality is that any one of you could have written this whole book by yourself, or edited this whole book by yourself, but you didn't. You did it together. And I would love to learn a little bit both. One, why did you decide to edit this volume together, the three of you? And two is, what were some of the things you learned along the way? And I'm thinking especially here, Felipe, in the group, you're the most senior scholar. Sergio and Maggie, you're more junior than Felipe. What were kind of those, how did that connect to the process of editing this volume? Maybe let's start with Sergio.
Well, I'm glad you pointed out the differences in our age. We were really lucky to have this grizzled old veteran bring us on board with Felipe. I think we have to start there. Is Felipe has been doing this work a little bit longer than us, and he's someone who, I think Felipe can speak on this, but he knows at the heart that Latino history, Latino studies is a community function, right? And so, as someone from our conversations, I understand that someone who learned a lot and gained a lot from that mentorship, he's always paid it forward with other scholars. And I think Maggie and I have really benefited from that. And so this began really as a conversation off of a conference presentation we did at the Western Historical Association in 2017, 18, I don't even remember. It was a few years ago. We did a panel presentation, and Felipe, opened the subject here with Maggie and I, doing it at edited volume. And from there, it ran away from us. We just had to basically, we were trying to keep up with the project. And I think the important thing to note is that we put this volume together in the middle of a pandemic, which is a phenomenally arduous task. And I'm really proud of us for having done that. And I'm really proud of each of the contributors for having come through. The original list of people that we put together is nearly intact at the end of the people who contributed to this volume. I think the biggest takeaway that I'll have from putting this piece together is that I'll never do anything that isn't done with people that I appreciate and that I want to be in community with and that are my friends. That was, I think, one of the most enjoyable pieces of this, was to work with Maggie and Felipe, getting to work together in person and then doing this virtually, and then getting to edit the work of my colleagues who I deeply respect, who I also consider friends, though, and who I think are doing really important work in our field. And so any sort of academic work moving forward for me is going to have to be done in the same vein, or it's not going to be fulfilling or enjoyable.
And Maggie, what was your experience doing this, especially during the pandemic? I forgot about that contextual point because I'm just used to these virtual realities at this point. But Maggie, tell us a little bit about your experience.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because it really, I think in some ways the pandemic allowed us to create even another type of community. But I would just start by saying, when we started this project, Felipe was somebody whom I deeply admired. And I remember asking him to be on this conference panel, just sort of being like, oh my gosh, kind of nervous. And he was just so generous and treated Sergio and I as peers from the very beginning. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this has been a dream project. It has just been one of those volumes where you're working with people you admire, you like, you respect. It's a joy to come together. You don't even mind the late nights. And the text chains that are going constantly, or even the holiday communications that sometimes happen, because it is just so joyful to work together. It was tough during the pandemic to get some of this done, but the commitment of our contributors and the responsibility we felt, I think, toward each other and toward our contributors, I think really sustained and drove us. But it also helped us to create this whole new community that I think we believed could exist, but that we brought into existence by doing this sort of work. And I just have to say, there was also an ice storm in the middle of this as we were finishing up one round of edits that Felipe and I experienced, and it broke Texas for like a week. Texas turned off, and it was right at a critical time of getting everything together, and it still came together.
And that ice storm was in 2021, is that correct? Last year?
February. Yeah.
It took out the entire grid, the entire electric grid in Texas. Is that correct? And we learned a lot about what happens when you have neoliberal capitalism just running amok in society.
Yeah, I let me just add to what Sergio and Maggie have pointed out. Yeah, when the conversation began and we were on this panel, it was very clear to me, and I think the audience is getting it right now, just how smart Maggie and Sergio are and the great work that they do. And so when I heard them present, and if you're ever at a conference with them, go listen to their presentations, because they're so well thought out, so well put together. And at the heart, they're storytellers. And you're not, you know what I mean? Like, that's what you want. You want to be able to go and hear something that's intellectually stimulating, but also that's going to, reach you right at the heart, right? Sort of get you animated about the important work that remains. And hearing them present, it was very clear to me that these are the folks that I want to collaborate with and come together and have these great conversations with, which we did. And we had many text chains that went on, and back and forth. And we came together in before the pandemic. Sergio, Maggie, and myself, we met in Houston, a suburb of Houston, in the Woodlands, actually. And it was a weekend, whatever it was, we came together. This would have been December of 2019, right, y'all? I think that's when it was. And, obviously we didn't know what was about to come, but in retrospect, having us get together and meet in person and have great conversations and map out the book helped us to stay on track, right? And to be able to do this. Maggie and Sergio are a lot more disciplined than I am as well, and so in terms of waking up early, they're both early risers. I wanted to start work at about 10:30 or 11, maybe get some coffee, maybe go for a run in the morning, something. But they were always ready to go and kept me on my toes. And I think we did that for each other. And we also cared very deeply about making sure that the division of labor was equal, right? Wherever we could help each other. And if one person was carrying the load for a particular moment because of family commitments that we had or other things, that we were able to make it up to each other in different ways. Doing this together, I have seen people try to edit volumes, and very successfully, people that do it, but I've seen it up front where it's one person trying to edit a volume and the amount of work that it is. So I had that experience going in and knew that if I was going to do this, that it had to be with a collaborative group. And like Sergio said, right, to have a group of people that you respect, that you love, and that you genuinely like to hang out with. Like, that's an important part. It's not just the intellectual work, it's also the time off, conversations, how's the family, what else is going on, all of these things that keep you rooted and grounded. And we had bumpy moments. There were a lot of moments where it's like, hey, we have to get on a phone call and we have some serious things to talk about. We got some decisions to make. And those were deep and reflective moments, and listening to what we all had to say in terms of what decisions we were going to make going forward and taking each other very seriously. I think we came out just a lot better scholars, but I think a lot better human beings, because we were able to listen to what we each had to say and contribute, and then say, okay, based on what we've got here, this is going to be the best decision that we're going to make for this volume. And I think the book that you show there and that Sergio has there in the background is a result of care and a result of the three of us and all of our contributors really just coming together and saying, let's do something really special and let's help each other get to that special place as much as we can. And we did it. We're very proud of it. And I'm hoping that, is the whatever kind of reviews or critiques or the work that comes out of it, I'm just so excited, to see what this book creates and the kind of, we wanted to sort of create and map out these questions for this field going forward. And I think we did that.
And in so many respects, I think one of the things I'm hearing from you all is that you can't really build with people who don't have love for you and respect for you. And I think part of that is because you can't have serious conversations unless you first have trust. And that's, something that I think, especially grad students, sometimes we get caught up in I'm not a grad student anymore, shout out to graduation, but I do think we as academics, as grad students, as those who are in this field often get caught up in the politics of celebrity and in wanting to build with the people who have the biggest name. But in reality, the things that have the greatest impact and have the most profound genuineness are often things that are built horizontally with those with whom we're in community with. And I love hearing that come out of this story. And speaking about building, one thing that one critique that often comes from community members about academics is that we are sometimes disconnected from the communities we write about. And I'm wondering, and the grassroots communities, the communities who may or may not have access to the time we have to write, to the archives we have, to the resources, to the very stories of the communities we're writing to, what do you see as the relationship between academics and the communities we write about, especially when it connects to faith and power? And I'm going to start with Felipe, because in so many respects, you've been writing about communities for longer than any of us. And I would love to hear about how you reflect on the relationship between the academic and the community members.
The community formed me, made me exactly, the kind of person that I am, cheered me on, supported me, a lot of prayers, not a lot of money, but prayers. There were a lot of prayers. And I feel like there's a sense of deep responsibility that I have. Mentors that helped me along the way, people that looked out for me, people that told me, hey, I think you should apply to graduate school. I think there's something there for you. And then my own community supporting me and uplifting me along the way. You develop a sense of responsibility to give back, but then there's also that accountability, right? Where the work that we do, I want to make sure that I'm always accountable to my community, to the people that I write about, to the people that I interview, that I include in my book, in continuing the relationship and making sure that that the work that I do best reflects the truth and best reflects the historical moment, right? It's not always gonna, reflect the way people's memory remembers the time. Real memory is a tricky thing, but I think people really value when you take the time as a scholar to check in and to make sure, so-and-so, am I as close to the truth as I can get here, right? Where am I off? What should I be looking at, and so forth? And I think that's really important. I mean, I think the archives, we're historians, we spend a lot of time in libraries and in archives, but it means something to go to the community you're writing about, to talk to the people. If they're, if you're lucky enough to be writing about a time period where folks are still alive, that I think it's to do that and to maintain that sense of accountability to the folks that you're writing about, because it is important, especially with Latino communities and Latino civil rights leaders and freedom movement leaders that haven't been given the recognition in this country as people that have contributed to making American democracy, to building this idea of a democratic society. So yeah, I that's been central to me, and I know that in our conversations, with Maggie and Sergio, that was important to all of us.
And Maggie, I want to ask this question of you, but from a slightly different angle, because some of your work around the Catholic Church, especially, which is a community of concern and accountability, but some of your work is critical of that institution. And so I'm wondering what this relationship between being an academic, but also speaking to and with the community, how that looks like for you when your work isn't so, it is raising the voices of people whose stories hasn't been told, but it's also critical of an institution that at times has been on the wrong side of history. How do you conceive of this relationship?
Well, it's complicated. It's sometimes a difficult position to be in. So, critiquing institutions of power is not fun always, and not easy a lot of times. And sometimes being a member of parts of that community also make it a little bit complicated. So I think the way I've tried to approach this is as working with folks within the institutional community as much as I can to authentically represent their experiences and their histories, but not shying away from those hard questions and those necessary critiques. A lot of the work that I do is oriented toward policy and legal history. And so one thing that I've tried to do is work with public-facing academics or folks who are working in advocacy roles to use this type of deep legislative and policy history that I've done in their own work in immigrant communities or immigrant justice movements, so that they have a policy that they can draw on when they're making arguments to various courts, for example. There's actually something there that they can immediately pull from, which is another way, I think, of making this history matter, but from a slightly more removed position. I will just say it is at times really uncomfortable to be critiquing an institution as powerful as the Catholic Church, and to have my own complicated relationship with it, and to reconcile that. And so I surround myself with a community of friends, family, and a community of faith that supports me in this as well.
And I'm wondering, for those of you who continuing the theme of this question, for those of you who identify as Latinx, I'm wondering if there's a particular role you see as a Latinx scholar specifically, or even a responsibility about doing academic work in a different way, precisely because of your own story, your own commitment as a Latinx scholar, specifically being part of that community, or also because of the relationship between the emergence of Latinx studies as a site of protest within the academy and your own vocation as a scholar. I would love to start with Sergio around this question.
Yeah, I mean, Jorge, I think you're hitting it right on the nail, that the tradition in which we're writing in, for those of us who consider ourselves Latino Latinx studies scholars, is one of protest, but also of seeking accountability, right? I mean, Latinx studies is born in the late 1960s out of this very same call, which is to hold accountable those institutions in our communities that have not always been open spaces for Latino people, right? And so the very essence of Latino studies is about responsibility and accountability. And I think our work follows in a similar vein, which is, looking at different institutions that are near and dear to our hearts as scholars, but also as Latinos, and saying that there's more work to be done. This volume, of course, follows in I think a bubbling tradition of holding Latinx studies accountable for not taking religion seriously enough. And we're not doing novel work here, right? We're not the first people to do this. There have always been scholars within the field who have said that we have to take faith and religion more seriously. But I think looking at the number of scholars in our book who are coming from outside of religious studies can show you that there are more and more of those conversations happening. I'm the people that I study both in this text and outside of it as well have always been asking a question that I think moves beyond the utilitarian understanding of religious institution as just being another space within Latino communities, but understanding that traditionally religious spaces and churches have had a very primary space within Latino communities, right? And so that means because they have had such an important role to play within Latino communities, that they also have a special responsibility to the communities that call them home. The sanctuary movement, which I study in this text, is really a story about white and Latino congregants saying that churches have to do more when they have such important cultural, social, economic capital within their communities to actually serve as beacons of hope and of safe harbor for those people who are seeking a form of asylum. And I think in our ways as scholars, we're trying to do similar work to hold our colleagues accountable to this work, to call them to the table, and to say that we need to be taking faith seriously. I'll just note one other thing, to this question of public scholarship. We all come to this question, I think, a little bit differently. My previous career was as a middle school teacher, and so whenever I write, I always have my middle school students in mind. Not to say that I write for my 6th and 7th graders, but I try to think about, what does this mean to the communities that I served before I became a scholar? And I try to commit as much time as I do doing academic scholarship towards public scholarship as well, because if our work isn't legible to broader audiences than the 50 to 100 people who are going to read our books, then we have to really ask ourselves, what's the point? And if we really do believe the stories that we're writing about are so important, we should also believe it to be incumbent that we should be sharing this story with as many people as possible.
And I'm going to insert myself here because, I very much resonate with what you're saying, Sergio. Yesterday and this weekend, I had the privilege of celebrating the centennial 100-year anniversary of the People's Church. And my chapter, my dissertation, my academic scholarship for the last several years has been around this specific church. And we had the opportunity over the last several months of putting together a booklet that shares the history of the church that's for the community, interviewing members of the community. And then on Saturday, we had a political education class around the Young Lords and people's visions of freedom. We had, some salsa live music in the evening. Yesterday, we had a service that really focused on what is the legacy of liberation theology in our communities. And then the afternoon, we had bomba and political education around what the African diaspora is in our communities and the complexities of, there was one individual leading who was talking about the fact that, they use the drums of their ancestors in the language of their Spanish colonizers, and how complex that is, but not running away from the complexity, just sitting with it and making meaning through it. And, also mariachi, having that as part of the celebration and all of that, for me, it was very impactful, in part because, I haven't pursued as of yet to write an academic manuscript from my dissertation. And part of that is because for me, I first wanted to make sure I gave back to the people who made this work possible, gave back in ways that were accessible to them, not just in terms of like academic writing, because I firmly believe that conversations about accessibility are actually about how do we bring people into the complex ideas, not about changing the ideas. But also because I think there are questions here we have as scholars about how we want to best represent our work, who we want to make it accessible to, and who we want to be in conversation with, which is a cool thing about this book, because it does have the opportunity to connect, yes, with academic audiences, but it also has the opportunity to connect with community groups, with political education courses, with churches, congregations, mosques, whatever case may be, and connect in those different ways. So I'm wondering, Felipe, for you, as someone who also connected to the People's Church, I saw you there on Saturday, I'm wondering how you see this concept of public scholarship as related to your own academic vocation and multiple forms of academic work outside of the traditional manuscript and traditional peer-reviewed article.
Well, I mean, one of the points you made when you were talking about this weekend, which by the way, it was wonderful to watch you facilitate that conversation with community members inside the church and to think about the historic role of the First Spanish United Methodist Church, the People's Church there in East Harlem, and the legacy of liberation theology in our communities, which is multifaceted, it's complicated, it's not as linear. I mean, it goes in multiple directions. But one of the things that I think about is, in the 1970s, you have an entire theological literature that grows out of liberation theology in Latin America, Black liberation theology in the United States, the civil rights movements, multiple ethnic and racial movements in the United States, the women's movement, where Latina and Latino theology emerged at this moment to give life to the church, to give sustenance, a kind of theological orientation around what Bishop Raymond Rivera, whom you know, and I got to spend some time with this past weekend, longtime pastor and social justice activist in New York City, the way that he talks about it in terms of a holistic ministry, right? To think about social justice, but then to also think about faith, our relationship to the sacred, all of these things, that they're not mutually exclusive, that they come together. And I think in our churches, we've seen that. And really to do that in this volume was really just to give a ground level analysis. What does it mean when we think about en conjunto, as you mentioned? What does it mean to talk about lo cotidiano, right? Which is what Latino and Latino theologians talk about, the everyday practices of faith. What does it mean to sort of take what Orlando Costas, the theologian, what does it mean when you talk about Ada María Sassi Diaz and others that laid the foundation for Latina and Latino theology? What does it mean to then take that and give it a ground level analysis? What did that mean in Central California in the 1950s? What did that mean in East Harlem? What did it mean in the South in the 1980s for sanctuary movements and different things like that? And I hope that we did in this book, I hope that we put something together that academics will read and engage, but also something that clergy and pastors, Sunday school teachers, people that are in the church will take to really sort of see this as the narrative of people of faith in the United States and those that have struggled with faith, right? And that, as Maggie has mentioned also earlier, the critique of the institution, right? There's a role for sustenance and what faith motivates us to do. And there's also a role to be extremely critical of religious institutions and the church in terms of where it's gone wrong and perhaps ways to bring it back more in line to democratic ideals, or even in that sort of radical tradition of Latina and Latino theology. So that's where I see it. I mean, I think what you did on Saturday, right? Leading those kinds of conversations, those are happening everywhere, right? Those are happening in multiple places across the globe all the time. And I'm hoping that religious studies scholars, as they study the 1970s, and as they study the rise of the moral majority and conservative faith, which is extremely important, that they also look at grassroots religious movements, that we also examine the pitfalls, the contradictions, the successes, the good times, the bad times, all of that, so that we understand that there is a tradition of activism, that there is a tradition of social engagement that people have different names for, right? Some people will call it radical, others won't. Others will look at it as their biblical calling. Others will look at it as their social justice calling. But that when you look at it in this holistic way, you see that it encompasses the multiple experiences of Latinos across the United States.
And as we're coming up on our time, because I could talk with you three forever, but even though time is a construct, we are reaching it. I would love to just briefly, to close, hear a little bit from each of you about what lessons you want to offer doctoral students who are kind of beginning their academic journey in this moment. The reality is that HGI's primary constituency is Latinx doctoral students, and bringing up the next generation of scholars. So as you think about the lessons and the through lines of this conversation about writing during a pandemic, about organizing during a pandemic, about giving back to communities, about being accountable to communities, about speaking truth to power and dealing with the flack afterwards. What is one lesson each of you wants to offer doctoral students who are beginning their academic journey? Let's go ahead and start with Sergio.
Dang, that's a heavy question, Jorge. I think we've kind of touched on a lot of it throughout this conversation. I mean, the number one thing, of course, is to do work that is meaningful to you and to do work that is sustaining to you. If you're in graduate school, you're probably slogging through, multiple years of academic study and perhaps writing a dissertation. And I wouldn't try to say anything to a doctoral student they don't already know, which is that if you're not studying something you're passionate about, it's not going to matter. But I think the same goes true when you're thinking about collaboration and who you bring into your community and what communities you associate with. And so that was the number one thing that I learned from. I think the other thing we've kind of danced around a little bit is the question of interdisciplinarity. Felipe noted that, of course, almost all of us in this volume are historians. We have some people who are coming from other fields, but the majority are historians. But I think out of the nature of our work, we have to venture beyond kind of our comfort zones academically in our training to do justice to the people that we are trying to write about. And so, the call I would have to graduate students is to have kind of a capacious understanding of what it means to do this type of work, and to be willing to kind of stretch yourself beyond what feels comfortable or what feels right to you, because our number one obligation is to the narrators that we're working with within our text. When I began my research, I didn't think I was going to study religion, but the more I dug into the history of Latinos in Wisconsin and Milwaukee, the more I realized it was impossible to tell their history without understanding their faith. And so that obligated me to stretch myself and to think a little more broadly about what tools I needed to do this work, and engaging in conversation with the people who contributed to this volume continues to add to that. People who draw from political history and legal history, and then of course beyond the fields of history as well.
Yeah, and I think there about our colleagues, another podcast, Keeping It 101, a Killjoy's Guide to Religion. Something they always say is that we may be done with religion, but religion is never done with us. So Maggie, what advice would you offer doctoral students in this moment?
So I would just echo Sergio and Felipe a little bit, and say, if not going to tell grad students things that they already know, but the importance of surrounding yourself with people who share the same values as you. They don't have to share the same ideas, but working with people whom you can really align with ethically or morally, because of the work that they're doing both inside and outside of the academy. Because at the end of the day, if you're working with folks who are super, super prestigious, but whose values do not align with your own, it's a recipe for toxicity and disaster. And that just, if you are part of a community that has really benefited from the institutional privilege of something like the Catholic Church, your scholarship can be an opportunity to call your people to step aside. And that has been my experience with my own community, that my scholarship is at times in its critique a call to say, hey, it's okay to sit down. It's okay not to have anything to say here, and to listen for just a little bit. And again, the importance of building communities across disciplines, and across fields of study. If you're a historian, surrounding yourself with folks who do not necessarily do the same work that you do. And again, like Sergio, I had questions about specific communities. I was interested in politics much more than religion. And as you said, Jorge, religion didn't get done with me. It just keeps on following me.
It's funny how that works. Felipe,
Yeah.
what advice do you have for doctoral students?
Well, I would agree with everything that Sergio and Maggie just said, and I think that I would just add to that we're just in a very difficult moment in our world. For those of us that live in the United States, the politics that have surfaced, that have sort of rekindled that legacy of racism in this country and white supremacy and the power that holds over people, and the ways in which the stories of our community of who we are have gotten distorted, or people try to distort or tell lies about immigrants in this country, people of color, people on the margins, poor working people. And I think it's just fundamentally important, being in grad school, whatever your field is in religious studies or outside theology, history, whatever it may be, that these are heavy times, and surrounding yourself with good people, doing the work that you love and being passionate about it, and then realizing that you're not alone, that in doing this, you don't have to sort of carry the weight of figuring it all out on your own. There's a lot of us out there that are invested in doing work that is telling the truth about working people in this country, that is telling the truth about immigrants, and that is really trying to get at the heart of what it means to live in a society that is multi-ethnic and multiracial, and the possibilities of that, even the pitfalls and things that have gone wrong over time. But that as you do this work, I hope that you see yourself as part of a larger community that's doing that, and just know that you have support from multiple sectors of the academy, and I'm sure within your community. Find those levels of support and then go do your work, because we have a huge responsibility on our hands right now as historians, and as people that are trying to tell this story and trying to get it right. So stick with it as best you can, and obviously know that you're surrounded by people, or surround yourself with people that love you, for sure. That's really important.
I think that for me, I've thought for a long time that being in the academy was, or being an academic and a historian and a theorist and to my people. I think what I've realized, especially through a lot of therapy and through a lot of community work and sitting with folks along the way, is that we can't do everything, to the point that all three of you made, but we can contribute in the ways that our gifts intersect with the needs of our people. And I think that as academics, we have a profound opportunity, again, just echoing everything that's been said, to contribute to our people by preserving our stories. We know that the people whose stories are lost are the people who are forgotten. And so often our people are forgotten because the politics of our society, they don't necessarily, not just don't preserve our stories, but also intentionally silence our stories. So to be working alongside the community as the people who preserve, lift up, challenge, and engage the stories of our people is fundamentally a political work that is about power and is about reclaiming our voice and power. So I want to thank all three of you for being here today for this amazing edited volume, Faith and Power, Latino Religious Politics Since 1945. And I want to thank all of you who have joined the HTI Open Plaza podcast here with Dr. Felipe Hinojosa, Dr. Sergio González, and Dr. Maggie Elmore. And of course, I'm Dr. Jorge Juan Rodríguez V. Thank you for listening.
This has been an HTI production. For more information, visit us at htiopenplaza.org. The Hispanic Theological Initiative provides Open Plaza as a public service. The views expressed by the guests are their own. Their appearance on this program, or any reference to a specific product or entity they represent, does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by HTI.